I'm Serena Carter, and I recently celebrated my 34th birthday. For a solid decade and a half, my relatives made it an annual tradition to mail out masses of glossy holiday greeting cards every single December. Yet, despite being their daughter, my face never appeared in a single one of those festive photos. Not even once. When I finally gathered the courage to ask my dad about my constant exclusion, he stared right into my pupils with a completely blank expression and coldly stated, "You just don't fit the family aesthetic on camera alongside the rest of us, Serena." Fast forward to this past November. My smartphone rang, and it was my mother offering an olive branch I had given up on ever receiving. They desperately needed me to join the annual Christmas portrait. After 15 years of being treated like a ghost, the doors were miraculously thrown open. I showed up at the photography studio half an hour ahead of schedule, but the conversation I caught through a slightly cracked door caused me to spin right around and leave the premises without uttering a single syllable to them. The package I subsequently shipped to my grandmother 3 days later resulted in my sister dialing my number and shrieking into the receiver at 2 o'clock in the morning. Before I dive into exactly what unfolded, please take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, but only do so if this narrative strikes a chord with you. Also, leave a comment letting me know what part of the world you are tuning in from and what the current time is on your clock. To properly explain my actions, I have to rewind the clock 15 years to the very first holiday season I was actively scrubbed from our family's visual history. I was only 19 during that initial incident. I had just returned home for my first college winter break, remaining blissfully ignorant enough to assume my household was relatively functional. Over a morning meal, my mother casually declared we were heading downtown to Harrison Studio for professional portraits. "The entire family is going," she mentioned while casually smearing fruit preserves on a piece of toast. "Make sure you dress up." I burned through 2 whole hours selecting the perfect outfit, a rich, forest green sweater dress. I applied my cosmetics with extreme precision and even took the time to curl my hair, a grooming step I rarely bothered with at that age. When our group stepped into the studio, a gentleman wearing a professional camera around his neck paused his equipment setup. He scrunched his forehead in mild confusion, remarking that he had only prepared the lighting for 3 subjects. My mother flashed him that overly manufactured grin she exclusively utilized for public interactions. "Serena is merely tagging along to spectate, aren't you, sweetie?" I froze instantly, lingering awkwardly in the entryway. I genuinely believed we were all participating in the shoot. Without warning, my dad clamped his hand around my elbow and forcefully directed me toward the corridor. His grasp wasn't physically agonizing, but it was incredibly rigid and intentional. "You just don't look right alongside us in photos, Serena," he muttered under his breath, his tone completely flat. "It has something to do with how your features catch the studio glare. These holiday mailers have to be flawless." "But Dad, that makes no sense," I pleaded. "You aren't required to make sense of it," he replied, letting go of my arm. "Your only job is to sit in the waiting area." I remained stranded in that reception room for 45 long minutes. Peering through a large glass divider, I witnessed the hired professional physically adjusting my parents and my sister, Megan. I watched the 3 of them share genuine laughter over a joke he made. I observed Megan flipping her golden blonde hair, hitting modeling angles as if she were born for the runway. While walking toward the restroom, I caught my reflection in a hallway mirror. The ambient studio illumination bathed my features. My reflection was beautiful, actually better than just okay. The deep green fabric made my eye color pop brilliantly. There was absolutely no issue with how I caught the light. There never was an issue. Fast forward another 3 years. I secured my accounting degree, proudly graduating magna cum laude. I had tirelessly juggled a pair of part-time jobs just to cover the cost of my course materials because my parents repeatedly claimed their finances were too tight to help. I survived on 0 sleep in the campus library, while Megan uploaded digital albums of her tropical getaway to Cancun, an all-expenses-paid trip gifted by our mother and father simply because she managed to complete her freshman year. My commencement took place on a brilliantly sunny May afternoon. I marched across the auditorium stage, keeping my chin elevated, grasping my hard-earned diploma. 3 brutal years of physical burnout and ultimate victory were condensed into that single stroll. Eventually, I tracked down my relatives amid the cheering spectators. My father already had his digital camera out. My mother was busy smoothing out the wrinkles in Megan's summer dress. "All right, let's capture some memories," my mother chirped excitedly. "Megan, go pose over there next to the water feature." Megan, the 19-year-old. The girl who had merely wrapped up her first 2 semesters of undergrad. The person who wasn't even wearing a cap and gown. I stood in silence as they snapped exactly 47 distinct images of my sibling. I tallied every single click. "Mom," I interjected, waving my leather-bound degree in the air. "Could someone possibly—" "Oh, we will snap a few of you in a minute, Serena." My mother dismissed me effortlessly. "The sun is hitting Megan perfectly right now." That minute never arrived. Ultimately, I had to politely flag down a random attendee to capture a lone photo of me in my graduation gown. The stranger was incredibly sweet about it. Returning to the house that evening, I discovered a brand new 8x10 wooden frame already hung on the living room plaster. It displayed Megan in her breezy dress, smiling brightly with the splashing water fountain gleaming in the background. Meanwhile, my university diploma remained discarded on the kitchen island exactly where I had dropped it. When December rolled around, I spotted the printer's proof for the holiday mailer resting on my mother's computer desk. The Carters, Merry Christmas. Megan was centered perfectly between Mom and Dad, glowing in a crimson outfit. The layout contained absolutely zero negative space where I logically should have been positioned. They had framed the shot tightly. 3 human beings composing a totally closed ecosystem. However, unbeknownst to me, a different family member had been consistently trying to mail me something annually, a heartbreaking secret I wouldn't uncover for another dozen years. By the time I reached my 20th birthday, I had constructed a stable existence that required zero validation from my relatives. I held the title of senior accountant at the firm Morrison & Wells. I leased a cozy apartment featuring gorgeous exposed brick walls that I furnished myself. Furthermore, I maintained a financial safety net that expanded reliably with every passing paycheck. It was around this time I crossed paths with Marcus at a local art exhibition. He was employed as the event's official photographer, and I was merely tagging along using a coworker's spare admission pass. He possessed incredibly warm eyes, fingertips constantly smudged with artistic materials, and a grin that crinkled the corners of his face. A quarter of a year into our relationship, we were dining out when he casually requested to view some pictures of my relatives. My vocal cords completely locked up. "Literally everyone has family pictures on their phone, Serena," he stated softly, not trying to force the issue. "When it comes to my relatives," I replied with heavy hesitation, "I happen to be the one member who is strictly forbidden from appearing in them." He didn't demand an elaborate justification. He merely extended his arm across the restaurant booth and intertwined his fingers with mine. Staring at the ceiling from my mattress later that evening, a harsh truth finally washed over me, a reality I had been dodging for over a decade. By quietly swallowing my own erasure, I had effectively signed off on it. With every holiday greeting that hit the postal system lacking my face, and every household portrait that pretended I was a ghost, I was giving them permission to edit me out of reality. If I continued to bite my tongue, I would eventually pass away as the forgotten child. A few weeks down the line, while strolling through a local nature trail, Marcus shared an observation with me. I occasionally get hired to shoot portraits for incredibly affluent clients, corporate executives, generational wealth, that sort of demographic. He nudged a pile of dead foliage with his boot. "Do you want to know a pattern I've picked up on?" "What?" I asked. "The households that are the most obsessively fixated on projecting a flawless image? They're invariably covering up something entirely rotten behind closed doors." My mind instantly flashed to those pristine holiday mailers, the meticulously matching garments, the heavily rehearsed facial expressions that never once featured my face. What massive illusion were my parents so incredibly desperate to maintain? And more crucially, who was the intended audience for this grand theatrical production? My maternal grandmother, Eleanor, had always existed as an enigma, intentionally kept multiple steps removed from my life. She resided by herself in a historic brownstone property roughly 3 hours north, enveloped by towering bookshelves and antique portraits. When my grandfather passed away, he had left her incredibly financially secure. Exceptionally secure, based on the hushed whispers I had occasionally caught. During my childhood, I was rarely permitted to visit her. My mother perpetually manufactured roadblocks. Your grandmother is exhausted. She isn't feeling up to visitors. Please don't pester her. Despite the distance, a greeting card featuring her delicate, shaky cursive would arrive religiously on my birthday. Every December, a petite package wrapped in simple brown paper would show up. I would dial her landline to express my gratitude, and we would lose ourselves in deep conversations about literature, local wildlife, and the intricate flower beds she cultivated. However, right around the time I turned 20, my calls started hitting her answering machine. The handwritten letters I mailed out ceased getting replies. My mother confidently informed me that Grandma was feeling mentally drained and required total isolation. So, I ceased my efforts. To me, it simply felt like one additional form of familial abandonment. Everything shattered when I turned 29 and bumped into Aunt Ruth. She was my mother's junior sibling, far more reserved, inherently gentler, and permanently relegated to the background. We serendipitously crossed paths at a weekend farmer's market. Eleanor inquires about your well-being relentlessly, she casually dropped while intensely inspecting a locally grown tomato as if it contained ancient wisdom. I fumbled my iced latte. She does. Diane repeatedly informs her that your schedule is simply too packed, that you have zero desire to make the drive. Ruth's facial muscles tensed up. But that is a complete fabrication, isn't it? I was under the impression Grandma had completely written me off, I stammered. Ruth gently placed the produce back into the crate. Your mother intercepts the communication, Serena. The envelopes, the voicemails. She has been pulling this stunt for years on end. My core temperature plummeted. Your grandmother genuinely believes you tossed her aside, Ruth added in a quiet, fragile tone. And it has completely devastated her spirit. She frequently mentions how much you resemble her, treated like a total outcast in her very own living room. A massive chunk of my life had been hijacked. I just didn't comprehend the sheer scale of the theft yet. Fast forward to November of this current year. My cell phone vibrated on a random Tuesday night. The caller ID read Mom. I hesitated, nearly letting it ring out. Serena. Her vocal tone was bizarrely delicate, entirely lacking its usual sharp edge. We're scheduling the annual holiday portrait for this upcoming Sunday. I braced myself for the cruel punchline. We actually need you to participate this time around. My brain refused to process the syllables. 15 solid years of being actively barred from the frame, and now she was demanding my presence? I maintained my professional, corporate accountant tone. Strictly numerical, entirely detached. Is this regarding Grandma Eleanor? My mother hesitated. Her health is failing rapidly. She specifically requested to see the entire family unit gathered together. Is this Grandma's demand, or is this your demand? I countered. Heavy, suffocating silence filled the cellular connection. It's a mutual desire, she finally lied, clearing her throat. So, can we count on your attendance? I require some time to mull it over. Don't drag your feet, she snapped, her true colors bleeding through. It's Sunday at 2 p.m. Harrison Studio. A brief pause. Oh, and make sure your outfit is red. That is our aesthetic direction this season. The line went dead before I could formulate a reply. I remained planted on my living room sofa for an eternity, glaring at the darkened screen. A decade and a half of you don't photograph well. A decade and a half of being aggressively scrubbed from every seasonal greeting, every major life event, every visual documentation of my genetic lineage. And now, out of thin air, I was suddenly granted VIP access simply because Grandma made a request. I immediately phoned Marcus. What is your assessment? I questioned after laying out the bizarre interaction. My assessment is that something highly deceptive is occurring, he replied methodically. Human beings do not alter their core behavior that drastically without a massive underlying motive. You could easily decline. Alternatively, he continued, slowing his pace, you could accept the invitation to uncover their actual agenda. My thoughts drifted back to Aunt Ruth's revelation. I thought about an elderly woman rotting away, convinced her granddaughter had ghosted her. I thought about 15 years of stolen affection. I am going to attend, I stated firmly. However, I will be executing this on my own specific timeline. I will arrive ahead of schedule and listen at the door before they even realize I am in the building. The following morning, I dialed Aunt Ruth. I require the unvarnished truth regarding this situation. No pleasantries, no warming up. Ruth released a heavy breath. I was anticipating your call. Diane formally invited me to the holiday shoot. For the very first instance in 15 years. I am aware. A weighty pause followed. Eleanor was transferred into a hospice facility roughly 8 weeks ago. She is actively getting her final affairs in order. Hospice. The terminology struck me like a brick to the chest. She is finalizing her last will and testament, Ruth elaborated. And she has been interrogating people. What specific interrogations? She wants to know why your face is mysteriously absent from all the visual records. Why you refuse to travel down. Why her handwritten notes remain ignored. My knuckles turned white around my phone. What narrative did Diane feed her? She claimed you are deeply estranged. That you made an independent choice to isolate yourself. That you simply loathe being associated with this bloodline. A scorching, toxic wave of rage boiled up in my throat. That is an absolute fabrication. I am fully aware, my dear. And I strongly suspect Eleanor is beginning to see through the smoke and mirrors as well. Ruth laid out the remaining puzzle pieces. Grandma's financial assets were massive, hovering right around the $4 million mark. Her initial drafted intention was to distribute it evenly among her 2 offspring and her grandchildren. However, her recent suspicions had caused her to halt the legal process. She was actively demanding undeniable visual confirmation that the family was completely unified and loving. Diane practically swore a blood oath to Eleanor that you would be standing in this year's portrait, Ruth disclosed. That singular promise is the only reason Eleanor hasn't legally completely dissolved the current will. Every confusing detail snapped together with nauseating precision. They didn't desire my presence because they missed my company. They didn't extend the invite because they finally recognized my intrinsic worth. They required my physical body as a legal prop. I was nothing more than manufactured evidence to trick a terminally ill woman into signing a lucrative document. Ruth, I breathed, my vocal cords remaining eerily calm despite the tectonic plates shifting inside my soul. They're absolutely not going to pull this off. What exactly is your plan? I am going to hand Grandma the undeniable reality. Later that evening, Marcus and I were stationed at my kitchen island. Are you entirely certain you want to proceed with this? He asked, completely devoid of judgment, merely checking my temperature. I need to physically hear them articulate their scheme out loud. I dragged a heavy cardboard storage bin out from beneath my mattress frame. And following that, I am going to present Grandma with everything they have been suppressing. Marcus lifted the lid. His eyebrows shot toward his hairline. The container was overflowing with 15 years' worth of Carter family holiday mailers. Every single solitary piece of cardstock they had distributed since I was 19 years old. How on earth did you acquire all of these? Next-door neighbors, Harold's corporate colleagues, Diane's literature club acquaintances, literally anyone on their distribution roster who was willing to hand over a duplicate. I fanned the glossy cards out across the countertop. I have been meticulously archiving them since the very beginning. Year subsequent to year, the identical sickening layout. Diane, Harold, and Megan. Grinning, visually flawless, wholly complete. And absolutely zero trace of Serena. Not a single time. Why did you hoard these? Marcus asked, inspecting a piece from 2019. If I am being completely transparent, I don't truly know. A tiny fraction of my brain assumed that eventually, somebody would require hard proof. Somebody whose opinion actually carried weight. I began stacking the evidence back together. I plan on compiling these into a massive binder. Right next to each card, I am going to place a photograph of myself from that exact same chronological year. Irrefutable proof of their actions. Marcus nodded in quiet agreement. And you intend to mail this package to Eleanor once Sunday wraps up? Right after I eavesdrop on their true sentiments regarding me. He reached across the island. I will be your chauffeur. I will remain stationed in the vehicle just in case things go sideways and you require backup. I appreciate you so much. No matter how this shakes out, he maintained eye contact. You are taking the moral high ground. That woman has a right to know her own life story. Sunday approached much quicker than anticipated. I slipped into my crimson dress, the exact color palette my mother had aggressively mandated. I applied my cosmetics and verified my reflection. My reflection was beautiful. Actually, better than just okay. It always had been. Let me pause the story right here for a second and ask you a hypothetical question. If you were trapped in my exact shoes, finally granted access after a decade and a half of being shunned, would you have actually shown up to that photography session, or would you have completely boycotted the event? Drop your verdict in the comments below. Type go or stay away. I am incredibly curious about your perspective. And if you haven't clicked that subscribe button yet, I highly recommend doing so right now, because the audio I captured at that studio radically altered the course of my life forever. Roughly 48 hours prior to the scheduled shoot, Aunt Ruth requested a brief coffee meetup. She walked into the cafe gripping an overly stuffed manila folder bursting with documents. I have been hiding this stash for far too long, she confessed, pushing the thick envelope across the tabletop. I genuinely should have handed this over to you a decade ago. I peeled back the metal clasp with trembling fingers. Inside sat dozens upon dozens of stationery pages, all decorated with my grandmother's sophisticated, looping handwriting, addressed directly to me. My knuckles shook as I opened the oldest dated envelope. December of 2009. My dearest Serena, I have not received any communication from you since your birthday passed. I sincerely hope the parcel containing the blue knit sweater arrives safely. I picked it because it matches your eyes perfectly. Your mother insists that your university studies are monopolizing your schedule. I fully comprehend the pressure, but please, the moment you find a spare second, ring your grandmother. I desperately miss the sound of your voice. All my love, Grandma Eleanor. I digested the next letter, and then the one after that. 15 continuous years of heartfelt correspondence that never made it to my mailbox. Birthday wishes, holiday check-ins, desperate pleas for me to visit, inquiries regarding my career path and romantic life. And woven deeply into the ink of every single page was profound confusion and stinging emotional agony. A matriarch who simply could not fathom why her beloved grandchild had suddenly gone dark. By the time I reached a note from 2018, the ink was practically smeared from my own falling tears. Serena, if I have somehow committed an offense against you, I beg you to speak up. I have mailed so many inquiries, and your total silence baffles me. Have I permanently lost you? She genuinely believed I threw her away like garbage. I croaked out, my throat tight. Diane illegally intercepted every single item, Ruth stated, her expression hardened by years of repressed fury. Inbound and outbound mail. For 15 entire years. But what is the motive? Total image control. Guaranteeing that Eleanor was only ever exposed to the fabricated family dynamic Diane wished to broadcast. I pressed the stack of letters tightly against my ribcage. These were no longer just pieces of parchment. They were forensic evidence. Hard proof of a beautiful bond that had been systematically assassinated. Grandma has to read these, I demanded. Yes, Ruth nodded affirmatively. She absolutely does. On the Saturday evening immediately preceding the shoot, Marcus and I functioned like an assembly line until midnight. We meticulously constructed the binder. Every spread narrated a 12-month cycle of abuse. On the left-hand side, we mounted the official Carter holiday mailer, the trio of them beaming, zero negative space left for a fourth member. On the adjacent right-hand side, we glued down a candid shot of my actual existence from that exact same year. A 19-year-old version of myself isolated in a cramped dorm holding a biology textbook, completely oblivious to my recent erasure. A 22-year-old me at my college commencement, clutching my degree, entirely unaccompanied. A 25-year-old me celebrating my very first corporate promotion, standing awkwardly in front of a gray office cubicle. Year subsequent to year, their highly edited illusion positioned right next to my deeply solitary reality. How far back does your master plan go? Marcus inquired as he centered a photograph. I never had a grand scheme, I replied, pressing down the adhesive corners. I merely hoarded the data. The evidence. I had no clue what its ultimate purpose would be. A gut feeling, perhaps? Perhaps, I murmured as I mounted the most recent card, which prominently displayed my relatives wearing matching green winter apparel. Perhaps I internally recognized that eventually, I would require a paper trail just to prove my own existence. We meticulously sleeved duplicate copies of Grandma's stolen correspondence as well. The very letters she had mailed that never graced my fingertips. Physical documentation of a massive, 15-year con job. Tucked into the very first plastic sleeve of the binder, I inserted a brand new letter I had authored. Grandma, for a decade and a half, I was led to believe you had completely forgotten my existence. I assumed you possessed zero desire to maintain contact with me. I was horribly mistaken. What you are about to witness in these pages is the suppressed reality that was violently withheld from the both of us. I am not providing this to inflict pain, but because you possess a fundamental right to understand the truth of what transpired. Because I was never the one who turned my back and walked away. I have always adored you. Your granddaughter, Serena. Marcus gently folded the heavy leather cover shut. This isn't an act of vengeance, he analyzed out loud. No, I whispered, tracing the binding with my index finger. This is simply the act of demanding to be perceived. The following afternoon, I would finally secure their verbal confession. And shortly after, Grandma would witness the unvarnished reality. Sunday arrived. At exactly 1:30 p.m., 30 minutes prior to call time, Marcus parked the vehicle a block away from Harrison's studio. Shoot me a text if the situation deteriorates. I absolutely will. The photography business was situated inside a modernized, high-end commercial plaza featuring trendy exposed brick and industrial bulb fixtures. The primary entrance was deadbolt, as Sunday was not their standard operating day, but my childhood memories reminded me of a discreet side door utilized exclusively for private sessions. I maneuvered through it without making a sound. The front reception area was completely abandoned. Low-volume festive instrumentals piped in through concealed ceiling speakers. Looking past the glass divider, I spotted the primary shooting area being arranged. A crimson canvas backdrop, fake powdered snow, and meticulously placed holiday props. Conversational murmurs leaked out from the private client dressing room. I flattened my spine against the drywall right next to the door, which had been carelessly left cracked open. I immediately recognized my mother's tone, followed by my sister's. I can't believe she's really showing up, Megan complained, her voice dripping with disbelief. She actually verified her attendance yesterday? My mother's cadence was sharp and entirely transactional. She is scheduled to walk in at precisely 2 o'clock. I cannot fathom why we are being forced to endure this. Megan released an obnoxiously dramatic sigh. 15 consecutive seasons of flawless greeting cards, and suddenly we are obligated to drag her into the frame. My pulse began hammering violently against my ribcage. It is a single, solitary photography session, Megan, my mother hissed, dropping her volume. I leaned in closer to catch the syllables. 60 minutes of faking a cohesive, joyful dynamic. Once it's over, reality resumes its normal programming. But why does Eleanor even give a damn at this point? She is practically comatose 50% of the week. She remains alert enough to dial her legal counsel. Silence hung in the air for a moment. Then, my dad's baritone rumbled from a deeper corner of the room. The inheritance is sitting at $4 million, Megan. $4 million. We plaster on fake smiles for a single afternoon. Eleanor signs the finalized paperwork, and we are financially untouchable. My lungs momentarily forgot how to process oxygen. So Serena is essentially just, what? Megan probed. A stage prop. My mother chuckled, a low, sinister sound. She has functioned as a stage prop her entire existence, sweetheart. She was just too dense to realize it. I clamped my palm over my own lips to stifle any audible reaction, but I had absorbed more than enough. I logically should have sprinted back to the vehicle right then, but a morbid curiosity demanded I hear the entire blueprint. Walk me through the logistics one more time, my dad requested. He was utilizing his calculated, corporate negotiation voice. Eleanor has been aggressively questioning why Serena is perpetually absent from our visual history, my mother recited, sounding heavily rehearsed. I initially spun a tale about Serena being overwhelmed with corporate accounting, claiming she values her extreme privacy and despises being photographed. She swallowed that excuse temporarily, but she has been relentlessly pushing the issue lately. She directly informed the attorney that she refuses to ink the final documents until she receives photographic evidence that we are a tightly knit, unified front. Meghan scoffed loudly. Unified. Hilarious. Therefore, the portrait, my dad continued. We snap a visually pleasing image containing all four of us. We overnight it to Eleanor's facility. She witnesses her estranged granddaughter appearing overjoyed in our presence. She executes the legal transfer, and we secure the bag. And following that? Meghan questioned. Following that, Serena retreats back to whatever hole she crawled out of. We completely ignore her existence until the next occasion we require her utility. A freezing sensation paralyzed my chest cavity. It wasn't shock. I had internally deduced this exact scenario. But hearing the sheer cruelty articulated so casually, so devoid of basic empathy, was staggering. I already forced the printing company to generate the prototype cards, my mother announced, her expensive footwear clicking sharply against the linoleum. Look right here. There is a designated negative space specifically engineered for Serena to occupy. Once the shutter clicks, the job is complete. She gets deleted once again. I peeked through the narrow slit between the door and the frame. My mother was proudly displaying a piece of thick cardstock. It depicted 3 beaming Carters with a glaringly awkward physical gap on the far left side, resembling a jigsaw puzzle with a singular missing piece they only intended to rent for an hour. She genuinely hasn't caught on to the ruse, my dad inquired. Serena? My mother let out a dismissive bark of laughter. She has been desperately pleading for an invite for a decade and a half. She is likely euphoric that we finally threw her a bone. Meghan let out a high-pitched giggle. So desperate. I physically recoiled from the doorframe. They genuinely believed I was a desperate, pathetic creature. They were roughly 3 seconds away from discovering how catastrophically wrong they were. I shoved the wooden door wide open. 3 pairs of eyes violently snapped in my direction. For a fraction of a second, time stood completely still. My mother's arm froze midair, still clutching the prototype card. My dad's facial features completely blanked out. Meghan's jaw literally unhinged. Serena. My mother was the quickest to reboot her system. Her manufactured, sugary smile slid onto her face like a theatrical mask. You are incredibly early. We weren't anticipating. I am fully aware. My vocal delivery emerged incredibly steady and chillingly calm. I caught every single word. The theatrical mask faltered. Darling, whatever bizarre context you think you overheard. I raised one finger and said the word, prop. I raised a second digit, adding for $1 million. A third finger went up. She fades into the background again. And finally, desperate. All the color instantly drained from my sister's face. My dad took a cautious step in my direction. Now, Serena, let's take a deep breath and not overreact to this, he instructed smoothly. I am decidedly not overreacting. I locked onto his pupils. I am finally reacting with the appropriate level of disgust. You are completely misinterpreting the dynamic here. My mother's tone now carried a defensive, jagged edge. We explicitly requested your presence. We have perpetually wanted you to be a part of this. Is that a fact? I pointed aggressively at the thick paper in her grip. Is that precisely why you custom-ordered a prototype layout featuring a gaping void? So you could seamlessly copy and paste me into the frame, only to crop me out whenever it suited your narrative? Dead silence. Nobody offered a rebuttal. 15 entire years. I refused to let my voice waver. 15 years of active erasure. And the sole motivation for extending an invite today is to actively defraud a terminally ill woman into believing you run a functional household. That is wildly inaccurate, Meghan attempted to interject. I am entirely finished. I pivoted toward the exit corridor. Do not ever attempt to contact my phone number again. Serena, my mother shrieked, her voice turning venomous. If you step foot out of that doorway, do not ever bother crawling back. I paused right at the threshold. Mom. I threw a final glance over my shoulder. You never actually permitted me to step inside the house to begin with. I marched directly out into the crisp December atmosphere. Marcus was idling near the sidewalk. He took one glance at my hardened expression and popped the passenger lock without requiring an explanation. Drive, I commanded. We have a highly sensitive package to deliver. We navigated the streets directly to Aunt Ruth's property. She was already stationed on her front steps, seemingly psychic to the fact that the afternoon would implode. I am safely assuming the family portrait did not materialize, she questioned as I stepped onto the pavement. Oh, it materialized. Just not according to their financial blueprint. I hauled the heavy leather binder out from the back seat. The physical mass of it felt incredibly heavy now. 15 years of psychological abuse bound together. I need you to transport this directly to Grandma. I extended the book toward her. Because if I utilize the postal service, Diane will undoubtedly intercept the package. Ruth slowly bobbed her head. I am scheduled to visit Eleanor's facility every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I can personally place it into her lap. Will you seriously do that for me? Ruth's eyes welled with moisture. I have sat back and witnessed my own sibling delete your existence for a decade and a half. I deeply regret not intervening a lifetime ago. She secured the binder against her chest. Allow me to finally rectify this. Marcus assisted me in verifying the final inclusions before she departed. The plastic sleeves contained the stolen letters. The timeline of photographs was perfectly sequential, highly organized, and utterly irrefutable. Are you absolutely positive about pulling this trigger? Marcus asked softly as Ruth unlocked her vehicle. She has earned the right to know the truth. I monitored Ruth's sedan as it vanished down the suburban street. They had fed her a diet of lies for 15 years. Lies regarding my character, lies regarding our dynamic, lies regarding everything. How do you anticipate she will react? Marcus asked. I genuinely had no clue. A fragmented piece of my soul prayed she would be empathetic. Another chunk was paralyzed by the fear that she would simply label me a liar, opting to digest my mother's fabricated reality over my hard evidence. However, I was entirely done cowering from the truth simply because the fallout might sting. Regardless of her ultimate ruling, I declared, at least her final judgment will be rooted in factual reality, rather than the fairy tale Diane authored. I barely caught a wink of sleep that evening, or the evening after. Somewhere inside a medical facility 3 hours to the north, my elderly grandmother was actively processing the fact that the grandchild she accused of abandonment had actually been violently kidnapped from her life. And the shockwaves would be permanent. 3 excruciatingly long days ticked by. The slowest 72 hours of my existence. On Tuesday at dusk, my screen illuminated. It was Aunt Ruth. She reviewed it. Ruth's vocal cords were thick with heavy emotion. She reviewed every single page. I locked my grip onto the kitchen granite to prevent myself from collapsing. And she wept profusely, Serena. For well over 60 minutes. My stomach plummeted into my shoes. Oh God, I made a terrible mistake. I shouldn't have. Stop, Ruth interrupted sharply. These were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of sheer rage. Furious, unadulterated anger. I released a massive, shuddering breath. She just kept repeating, my little girl. They stole my little girl away from me. Over and over again. Ruth audibly sniffled. She was completely unable to process how Diane could execute such a betrayal. Her own flesh and blood. Does she actually trust my version of events? Honey, she physically held 15 years of letters authored by her own hand. Envelopes you clearly never replied to because you never cracked the seal. The forensic evidence is completely bulletproof. A tidal wave of absolute relief washed through my nervous system, so powerful it caused my kneecaps to buckle slightly. She immediately phoned Diane, Ruth elaborated. Roughly 20 minutes after I exited the building. I am not privy to the exact dialogue, but Diane ended up calling my cell phone screaming like a banshee shortly after, ranting about how I was responsible for detonating the family unit. What is Grandma's next move? A brief silence. She contacted her legal representation this morning at dawn, Serena. She is actively altering the documents. Ruth, I swear to you I didn't compile that binder to orchestrate a payday. She is fully aware of your intentions. And that is precisely the reason she is executing the changes. Ruth's voice grew incredibly tender. She explicitly told me Serena wasn't angling for a payout. She was desperately crying out to be perceived, and I am guilty of failing to perceive her for 15 years. Hot tears slid down my jawline. She formally requested your presence, Ruth added quietly, prior to her announcing her final verdict to the rest of the bloodline. When? This upcoming Thursday. Are you available to make the drive? I made eye contact with Marcus, who had been silently monitoring my reaction from the living room. He offered a firm nod of support. I will absolutely be there. Excellent. Ruth paused for a second. She has been holding out for 15 years to see you, Serena. Please don't prolong her wait. I need to stop and ask for your opinion again. Do you genuinely believe I made the correct moral choice by mailing that explosive binder without offering any prior warning, or should I have facilitated a face-to-face sit-down with my parents first? Sound off in the comments with right or wrong, and justify your reasoning. I truly want to read your logic. And if you are still actively listening to this saga, make sure you smash that notification bell, because when my sister finally managed to bypass my blocked numbers, her vocal tone indicated that a massive bomb was about to detonate. The incoming call triggered at exactly 2 a.m. I had finally managed to drift into a state of deep REM sleep, my first peaceful rest in nearly a month, when my bedside table lit up the dark room. Megan's contact info glared on the display. I accepted the connection on the third ring. What on earth did you pull? She shrieked, the sheer volume forcing me to pull the device several inches away from my head. Marcus bolted upright beside me, instantly snapping to attention. A pleasant good morning to you as well, Megan. Grandma dispatched certified envelopes to every single one of us. Dad is literally wearing a trench in the living room rug, pacing back and forth. Mom is currently weeping, like genuinely shedding tears. I shifted into a seated position against the headboard, intentionally keeping my register monotone. I simply provided Grandma with the unedited reality. The reality? Megan's laughter was sharp, chaotic, and completely unhinged. You totally annihilated us. You practically shoved all those old greeting cards and hoarded letters in her face like a prosecutor. We are supposed to be blood relatives. Are we actually? I countered in a hushed tone. Because genuine relatives do not actively scrub each other out of existence. Relatives do not illegally hijack an elderly woman's mail for a decade and a half. Relatives do not refer to their own kin as a legal prop. Dead air radiated through the speaker. Grandma violently slashed Mom's financial allocation right down the middle. Megan's voice fractured completely. And she gutted mine too. She legally transferred the vast majority of the estate over to you and Aunt Ruth. I never once requested a single dime. But you secured the bag anyway, didn't you? You successfully executed your master plan. My master plan, I articulated slowly, was ensuring Grandma understood that I never willingly abandoned her. My grand agenda was forcing her to look at me, to authentically witness my existence before her lungs gave out. The inheritance was entirely irrelevant to me. That is a highly convenient stance to take when you are the one cashing the check, Megan snapped. Deep exhaustion finally washed over me. I was completely drained from defending my sanity. I was done providing context to people who refused to listen. I refused to issue a single apology for exposing the facts. If introducing the truth successfully demolished this family dynamic, then the dynamic was incredibly toxic and fundamentally unworthy of protection. You are going to deeply regret this stunt. No. I met Marcus's steady gaze across the dark bedroom. I genuinely promise you that I won't. I terminated the call. Harold dialed my number just after sunrise. His cadence had drastically mutated. It lacked any aggressive heat. It was completely sterile and highly strategic. It was the exact persona he adopted when corporate boardroom negotiations were stalling out. You have made a massive error in judgment, Serena, he stated coldly. Good morning to you as well, Dad. I am not playing games with you. He blew out a sharp gust of air. Do you possess any comprehension of the collateral damage you have inflicted upon this household? I merely presented Grandma with the factual timeline. If deploying the truth catastrophically damages the structural integrity of the household, then perhaps you should have kept your mouth shut. If the truth easily shatters the household, perhaps the foundation was completely rotten to begin with. 15 years of maintaining the peace. 15 years of preserving public optics, and you nuked the entire operation from orbit simply because you hold a petty grudge over some holiday snapshots. A highly compressed wire finally snapped inside my brain. Preserving the peace? I let out a dry, humorless chuckle. You define actively deleting your own offspring from every recorded memory as preserving the peace? You define stealing a lonely woman's mail for a decade as stability? That isn't maintaining order, Dad. That is calculated sociopathy. You lack the mental capacity to grasp the social pressures we were navigating. I grasped the situation flawlessly. You desperately required a cosmetically perfect illusion, and my physical presence ruined the framing. A tense, heavy silence expanded across the cellular towers. When he finally spoke again, his pitch had dropped. It was almost manipulative in its softness. Eleanor has legally willed you a highly substantial chunk of capital. If you are willing to dial her facility, perhaps massage the situation and convince her to backtrack, we could potentially draft a private agreement. A completely even split behind closed doors. I allowed his pathetic proposition to float in the dead air. You are literally attempting to bribe me at this exact second. I am attempting to approach this like a rational adult. Absolutely not. My voice remained entirely unwavering. You are desperately attempting to purchase my loyalty the exact same way you attempted to utilize me as a physical stage prop to secure her autograph. Serena, I am losing my patience. Dad, do not ever dial this number again. If you sever this connection, we are permanently finished. Irrevocably. I briefly visualized 15 years of blank spaces on cardstock. I visualized the dozens of unanswered envelopes. I visualized an elderly woman slowly decaying, internally devastated that her favorite grandchild had ghosted her. Dad, I murmured softly. We were permanently finished over a decade ago. You just lacked the observational skills to notice. I pressed the red icon. 7 days later, Aunt Ruth phoned to deliver the final casualty report. It is an absolute madhouse in their zip code. Her tone wasn't exactly dripping with glee, but it certainly lacked any genuine sympathy. Diane has been shedding tears nonstop. Harold has been blowing up the attorney's phone trying to legally invalidate the updated documents. Does he possess any legal standing to accomplish that? 0. Eleanor underwent a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation just last month. She was declared 100% mentally competent. Her legal signatures are completely bulletproof. I poured myself a steaming mug of dark roast, desperately trying to mentally process the sheer scale of the fallout. What were the exact percentage shifts? Diane and Megan's allocations plummeted from roughly 40% apiece down to a combined maximum of 15%. Harold was entirely cut out. He isn't a blood relative anyway. The overwhelming majority of the estate defaults directly to you and myself. Ruth took a slow breath. Eleanor explicitly stated this maneuver was never about enacting revenge. It was purely about financially recognizing the individuals who genuinely cherished her. I reflected on the stolen correspondence, the massive chunks of missing time, and the beloved matriarch I had miraculously recovered right at the finish line. What about their social circle? Has the truth leaked out into the community? Ruth let out a heavy sigh. Eleanor also mailed out highly detailed explanatory letters to a handful of her longtime associates. She even enclosed photocopies of a few of the deceptive holiday mailers, alongside her own letters that Diane had callously marked return to sender. Mom must be physically ill with embarrassment. She absolutely is. Word on the street is that a congregation member directly confronted Harold after Sunday service, demanding to know if the rumors about them hiding their own child were factual. He practically choked on his own tongue trying to formulate an excuse. A highly complex emotion bloomed in my chest. It wasn't pure vindication. It was a messy, knotted feeling. My core intention was never to publicly humiliate them, I confessed. I strictly wanted Grandma to be aware of my reality. I completely understand that, Ruth replied gently. However, the truth occasionally carries massive collateral damage. They constructed their entire public persona atop a massive sinkhole of lies, Serena. The second the lie evaporated, the persona imploded with it. How is Meghan handling the reality check? She attempted to phone the hospice center to beg for forgiveness. Eleanor explicitly instructed the nursing staff to decline the transfer. A brief pause. She informed them that the sole grandchild she possessed any desire to interact with was you. The Christmas holiday materialized roughly 3 weeks down the line. Marcus and I opted to spend Christmas Eve over at Aunt Ruth's residence, throwing together a homemade dinner and binging classic cinema. The evening was incredibly low stakes, highly peaceful, and utterly flawless. The following morning, I was checking my mailbox when I discovered a strange envelope. It lacked a return label, but the loopy penmanship was instantly recognizable. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had lived next door to my parents for 2 decades. I sliced the paper open with unsteady hands. Folded inside was the brand new, officially printed Carter family holiday mailer. I stared intently at the glossy cardstock for several minutes. There they stood. Mom, Dad, and Meghan, meticulously arranged in front of an aggressively decorated evergreen tree. However, the vibe was entirely corrupted this time around. Their facial muscles appeared tightly wound and incredibly forced. My dad's jawline looked like it was forged from iron. My mother's undereyes appeared noticeably swollen, a detail even the high-end Photoshop software couldn't completely mask. Meghan was positioned several inches away from the parental unit, tightly crossing her arms defensively against her chest. Furthermore, the standard cheerful typography was entirely absent. There was no happy holidays from the Carters splashed across the bottom. The text merely read a highly sterile, generic season's greetings in a basic font. And strikingly, there was no gaping physical void on the left-hand side where I was supposed to be pasted in. They had forcefully squeezed their shoulders together, desperately attempting to project the illusion of a completely enclosed, functional trio. But the entire visual balance was radically skewed. It looked deeply asymmetrical, clearly indicating that a vital structural component was missing, and no amount of posing could camouflage the defect. "What are you looking at?" Marcus asked, approaching me from behind with a fresh mug of coffee. I silently handed him the glossy paper. "Huh." He tilted his chin, analyzing the image. "They look absolutely tortured." "Yeah." I placed the card face up on the kitchen island. "They really do. Does looking at that bring you any joy?" I chewed on the interior of my cheek, genuinely analyzing my own emotional state. "No," I finally conceded. "It honestly just depresses me. But not for my own sake anymore. I feel pity for them." Marcus draped a warm arm over my shoulders. 15 years ago, they utilized a camera to completely sever you from the family unit. And now, they lack the technical capability to crop out the massive void your absence created. I rested my head against his chest. They had exerted a massive amount of energy attempting to render me invisible. And ironically, even within the confines of their precious portraits, my absolute lack of presence was screaming significantly louder than my physical body ever could have. On the 27th of December, we made the drive up to the medical facility. Grandma Eleanor was stationed in her standard room, bundled tightly in a plush blue knit sweater despite the indoor heating being cranked up. The heavy leather binder we had crafted remained proudly displayed on her bedside table. Ruth claimed she refused to let the book leave her line of sight. My beloved family has arrived," she announced as we crossed the threshold. Ruth had driven up several hours prior. She was standing near the window blinds, beaming widely as Marcus and I approached the bed. "Allow me to capture this moment." Ruth retrieved her smartphone from her pocket. An authentic family portrait. Grandma extended her frail fingers toward me. I dropped to my knees directly beside the wheels of her chair, while Marcus positioned himself squarely behind us, resting a heavy, comforting palm on my right shoulder. Ruth tapped the screen. I heard the digital shutter effect and flashed my teeth. I genuinely, radiantly smiled for the camera for the very first time in my adult life. "Now this," Grandma pointed a trembling finger at the digital display. "This is the exact definition of a family. Highly flawed, incredibly genuine, and entirely composed of individuals who share mutual, unconditional affection. She slipped a hand into the pocket of her knit sweater and transferred a tiny object into my palm. It was a petite envelope with my first name scrawled across the front in her fragile cursive. "Take a look," she encouraged gently. Tucked inside the paper was an ancient, physical photograph. The borders were heavily yellowed from decades of oxygen exposure. It depicted an exhausted but glowing woman resting in a maternity ward bed, delicately cradling a swaddled infant. It was Grandma, holding my tiny body on the exact day I entered the world. I flipped the photo over. Serena, the absolute sunshine of my existence. The very second they placed you in my arms, I was certain you possessed magic. Hot moisture flooded my vision and cascaded down my face. You hung onto this the entire time? She gripped my knuckles with a shocking amount of physical force. They aggressively attempted to convince the world you were invisible, my sweet girl. But my eyes never once lost sight of you. We lingered in that hospital room until the sun fully set, chatting endlessly about profound concepts and mundane nonsense. Marcus managed to pull several belly laughs out of her. Ruth recounted embarrassing anecdotes from her teenage years. I simply maintained a physical grip on my grandmother's hand, permanently etching the topography of her wrinkles into my memory banks. It would unfortunately serve as our final holiday season together. But simultaneously, it was the only authentic one we ever truly shared. Grandma Eleanor drew her final breath on the 3rd of March. Ruth assured me the transition was incredibly peaceful, occurring while she was deep in sleep. The faded photograph of her clutching my newborn body was found tightly interwoven between her fingers. The memorial service took place on a brutally frigid Tuesday afternoon. The sky was an oppressive gray, spitting down a constant drizzle, the exact atmospheric conditions required for mourning. I claimed a seat in the very front pew alongside Ruth and Marcus. My parents and Megan occupied the benches on the entirely opposite side of the central aisle. We exchanged zero dialogue. We actively avoided any accidental eye contact. The ceremony was incredibly understated. Eleanor had explicitly banned any theatrical, long-winded speeches in her final instructions. The agenda simply consisted of recitations from her preferred literary poets and a few hymns performed by her local church choir. Following the burial, during the catered reception, Megan slowly gravitated toward my table. Serena. Her physical presence seemed severely diminished. She lacked her standard high-gloss, heavily curated aura. "Do you have a minute to speak?" I scanned my sibling's face, actively searching for the venomous cruelty I had endured at the photography studio. I searched for the condescension. All I could locate in her pupils was absolute terror. "What exactly is on your mind, Megan?" "I am so deeply apologetic." The syllables tumbled out of her mouth in a chaotic rush. For literally everything. The holiday mailers, the vile insults I spewed. I genuinely did not comprehend. I mean, logically I knew what was occurring, but I completely failed to process the gravity of it. You completely failed to process that I was an actual human being with a pulse. I completed her thought for her. I was merely an inconvenient obstacle blocking the lighting. Her inability to form a rebuttal confirmed my statement. "Megan." I purposely lowered my vocal register, keeping it incredibly soft. "I completely forgive your actions." I truly mean that. A massive wave of tension evacuated her facial muscles. However, issuing forgiveness absolutely does not equate to me desiring a relationship moving forward. It simply means I am prioritizing my own internal tranquility. Her expression instantly shattered. "I desperately need you to process this concept," I pressed on. "I am not enforcing this boundary to inflict emotional damage upon you. I am enforcing it because I have wasted 34 years of my existence desperately trying to audition for a slot in a household that viewed me as a parasite. I have officially retired from the audition circuit." I reached out and lightly tapped her forearm. A concluding physical interaction. "I sincerely hope you eventually locate whatever validation you are constantly hunting for. But you are absolutely not going to extract it from me." A solid 30 days post-funeral, the legal inheritance was fully distributed. Grandma transferred ownership of the massive upstate brownstone directly into my name, the exact property overflowing with vintage literature, framed memories, and the lingering spirit of a matriarch I barely interacted with but fundamentally adored. Ruth was granted an identical portfolio. My parents and Megan received a highly fractional payout, technically enough capital to survive comfortably, but a catastrophic downgrade from the massive windfall they had been banking on. But the financial deposits were completely irrelevant. The true treasure was located inside a storage container. The package was delivered to my apartment lobby on a breezy April morning. It was a heavy, wooden cedar chest that Ruth had unearthed while organizing the brownstone's attic space. The interior was completely packed with decades upon decades of visual history. Eleanor's entire chronological existence preserved in faded, sepia-toned squares and high-contrast black and white film. I scattered the archive across my dining room table, with Marcus hovering right by my shoulder. Together, we acted as forensic historians. And that is precisely when I uncovered the missing link. It was a group portrait dated 1965. It featured Eleanor's bloodline, her mother, her father, and multiple siblings, all clustered together celebrating some generic winter holiday. And right there, hovering awkwardly on the absolute fringe of the composition, completely detached from the central huddle, stood a dark-haired teenage girl projecting massive insecurity through her eyes. My grandmother at 16 years old. Physically present, but utterly exiled from the inner circle. Exactly like me. I flipped the vintage square over. An unidentified relative had scribbled a caption in blue ink. Eleanor, the difficult child. Perpetually generating conflict. My lungs completely seized up. She mirrored my exact existence. I shoved the paper toward Marcus. She was the designated scapegoat. They violently pushed her to the margins, too. And in that fraction of a second, the entire psychological puzzle solved itself. My mother had been raised under the roof of a woman who had been systematically degraded and ignored by her own blood. Consequently, my mother only possessed the emotional vocabulary to degrade and ignore her own offspring. The toxic blueprint had been flawlessly passed down the generational ladder simply because no one possessed the courage to torch it. Until this exact moment, I stared intensely at the frozen image of the teenage Eleanor. Completely segregated, deeply insecure, desperately starving for a sense of belonging. This generational curse stops right here, I whispered into the quiet room. Marcus tightly interlocked his fingers with mine. Whenever we decide to bring children into this world, they will never have to question their value. Their faces will be proudly displayed in every single portrait, deeply woven into every single memory. I absolutely refuse to let the timeline loop. It has been exactly 8 months since I walked out of that strip mall photography studio. I am currently lounging inside Grandma's historic brownstone, which is now officially my brownstone, observing the autumn foliage detach from the branches outside the bay window. Marcus is currently hovering in the kitchen, brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The interior plaster is completely plastered with frames now. Our personal photographs, genuine friends, and the chosen family we have organically cultivated. And resting prominently in a sterling silver display above the hearth is the digital snap from the hospice facility. Ruth, Marcus, Grandma Eleanor, and myself. An authentic, deeply flawed, but incredibly beautiful family unit. Our unit. Every so often, my brain drifts back to those glossy holiday mailers. 15 consecutive years of aggressively curated smiles that actively erased my existence. For the longest time, I was thoroughly convinced that my exclusion meant I carried zero intrinsic value. I was fundamentally incorrect. I always carried immense value. I mattered the entire time. The only component missing from the equation was surrounding myself with individuals capable of recognizing it. My parents have completely ghosted me since the memorial service concluded. Megan has maintained total radio silence as well. Historically, that lack of communication would have shredded my mental health. Today, it simply feels like breathing fresh air. Because this is the ultimate lesson I walked away with. You possess absolutely zero power to force an individual to cherish you. You cannot tap dance and perform your way into the good graces of a community that has preemptively decided you hold no worth. However, you absolutely possess the power to construct an entirely new foundation. A household rooted heavily in unvarnished truth rather than manufactured optics, valuing physical presence over cosmetic perfection. They successfully scrubbed me from their printed cardstock, but they completely failed to delete me from the narrative of my own life. If you made it to the very end of this video, and you have personally navigated the agony of being completely invisible, whether that's inside your own household, within your corporate environment, or anywhere else, I urgently need you to absorb this fact. You are never the root of the issue. Their absolute blindness to your brilliance is a reflection of their own brokenness, not a reflection of your actual worth. And eventually, you will cross paths with people equipped with the proper vision. People who enthusiastically clear a seat at the table for you. People who will never, under any circumstance, demand that you fade into the background. That concludes my personal journey. Now, I am incredibly eager to digest yours. Has your own flesh and blood ever made you feel completely invisible? Please share your experiences down in the comments section. I dedicate time to reading every single submission. You are not operating in isolation. You honestly never were. Thank you so immensely for riding this emotional roller coaster with me until the final seconds. If this narrative resonated with your soul, please crush that subscribe button and activate the notification bell. It signals the algorithm that you crave more content in this exact vein. Take a glance at the description box for a curated list of similar sagas I highly recommend. I guarantee they will keep your eyes glued to the screen just as intensely. Drop a comment right now. What global region are you streaming this from? And more importantly, how would you have handled the situation if you were trapped in my exact position? I will catch you guys in the next upload.